what am I going to talk about today? I will present some insights from excessive smartphone use research, and I will ask myself, and you might ask yourself, and you might ask others if smartphone addiction is a thing, and if it is a thing, then why do some people tend to engage in excessive technology use? And the second part, like a short part, I promise, will be about how we can implement smartphones and other data sets to provide a better picture of who humans are. Just a little about me. I just recently received a PhD degree on the topic of smartphone use from psychology. Now I'm also working with one public company trying to develop a measurement tool for digital literacy. And on the other side, I'm also working at the Mathematics and Statistics Institute, where I'm helping to develop or promote mathematics education. So, specifically, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to answer these questions that may be pressing for you. Also, I will, for instance, I will also present you some research knowledge or insights from research, what has been found in relation to smartphone use. If you should be worried about yourself, your partner, your friends, maybe your kids. Also, I will end up in how some problematic main methodological aspects in this research that also applies to psychology in general has inspired me towards looking into a new emerging field called psychoinformatics. And finally, I will try to draw a couple of examples, maybe one, so how digital technology use may have theoretical and practical relevance. So, as you might remember, and you probably use it still, there are several paper-based technologies that have helped you to keep yourself productive. So you have a calendar on your table, or you have a paper to-do list. You put some sticky notes with some ideas on the wall, and maybe you used encyclopedias. I remember when I was in primary school, we did use those encyclopedias, and I was kind of surprised that these things were a thing then. Of course, a couple of years later, this wasn't a thing. Everything can be found from your own device, and actually you don't need your own device. You can just throw that device away, access the same functionalities from different kinds of devices. Now, of course, because we can keep ourselves virtualized and maybe ever more, you might have witnessed in your life or in the lives of someone else some situations where people may seem to be too highly engaged in their device use. For instance, you can go on YouTube and you can, I suppose, YouTube, not Google, a toddler swiping a magazine. So the toddler has been so accustomed to a tablet that she actually thinks that a magazine works the same way, trying to swipe away pages instead of turning them. There are also some interesting videos where small toddlers go to a window in a home and they try to swipe away all this reality they see, trying to get themselves in another reality. For many of you, and I think in one of the presentations, it was also asked that probably many of you wake up, the first thing you look at is your smartphone. When you go to bed, the last thing you look at is your smartphone. And maybe your partner doesn't like that, but then again, if your partner has the same habits, maybe, it doesn't matter, because phone snubbing, phobbing is a really increasingly common pattern in romantic relationships. It basically means that you have partners, they're on the couch, on the sofa, maybe watching TV, but actually they're on their phone. And on their phone, they're also talking to each other instead of actually just exchanging a few words live there. Friends in cafes. I mean, this is a common sight. If you go to any cafe, you probably see that people are in their phones, and it's perfectly okay. Not saying that's bad, but yeah, some people do think it's bad. There are various games. For instance, you put a pile of phones on the table. Whoever takes their phone first has to pay for all the dinners, and so on. And finally, there are a lot of traffic accidents where one's device use has been the culprit of evil, whether you are a pedestrian walking into a street post or lantern, or you're driving and watching this new Mindhunter season on Netflix and maybe getting someone injured or even killed. So this has, brought upon valid attention to this whole issue. Are we maybe too engaged in our device use, whether it's smartphone, tablet, computer, whatever, and maybe could it be that we're addicted to this device, we can't live without it? So firstly, I do need to emphasize, and I will show you on the next slide, that there are some alarming findings, but on the other side, I also want to sort of acknowledge the fact that mainstream science, mainstream researchers don't use the term addiction. So if you hear something about smartphone addiction again, then I wouldn't say necessarily disregard, but just take it with a grain of salt, because contemporary approaches to this whole topic disregard addiction as a misnomer for this whole thing. Like, what are people exactly addicted to? Is it the phone itself? You cannot live without specific phone, that object. Is it the phone use? It's so enjoyable to use the phone, but it doesn't matter which device. Or is the addiction actually something in the phone, and your phone is just like means to feed that addiction, be it gambling, cyber sex, shopping addiction, whatever. But nevertheless, as I mentioned, there are some findings in excessive smartphone use research, and summary of it is like, if you can imagine that something is bad, it's probably related also to excessive smartphone use. Now, this may make you worry. You can see that people tend to be more depressed, anxious, lonely, poorer academic performance in school kids, and poorer workplace productivity. So, some people, many people typically try to make the leap that, excessive smartphone use is bad, it makes you more depressed, anxious, less productive, etc. But actually, I was thinking about only showing nice pictures, but why not show some bit more boring scientific stuff in grayscale? This is a huge model. This is maybe one of the more prominent models, contemporary models, that try to explain why in some people, you could exhibit those problematic smartphone use patterns. And the whole basis in this model, where you can see there's a ton of different variables, a ton of different interactions between almost every variable, and on top of that, there's feedback loops. So, like, good luck with trying to figure out what's actually going on there. But the modern take typically is that it's not smartphone use that makes you necessarily depressed or anxious, dumber. Rather, it's the other way around. So if you tend to be more depressed, if you have some core characteristics, individual differences, for instance, your personality traits, you are more the worrying kind, say, in genetics, in experiencing psychopathology such as depression, anxiety. All these preconditions basically add up on every step in this model. Basically, say if you are a more worrisome person, you also tend to experience sadness more. It's likely that your emotional coping mechanisms are not fully functional, or your mood regulation is not very adaptive. So in these cases, what people tend to do, they go online, using this as a mood regulator, means to cope with their negative emotions. They browse mindlessly, typically, don't do anything, and this is how basically they will end up in having a lot of screen time, a lot of time spent on like some application, and because this tends to be like the, say, drug of choice, if you continue with this analogy of addiction, then it tends to intensify over time and develop into just a nasty habit. So you will have a nasty habit. I don't know, you got a poor grade, or your boss said something evil to you, or your application doesn't work. Then you just go and browse yourself away. You feel better, but then you come back to the fact that still in the same situation. I guess I'm going to Reddit again. So. Yeah, bottom line, if there's like anything you might want to remember, is that it's typically not that technology use is, it may have disruptive effects, but it's not like the culprit of evil for you. It's rather something else is going on there, and maybe you should look into that. And some problems with this whole research field is, how much is excessive use? So should there be a cutoff of minutes per day that you're using your smartphone, or like your phone checking count? How many times do you look at your phone to be considered as excessive? But this is tricky because a lot of stuff, including in Estonia, you can do a lot of communication and transactions between the state and yourself on your phone. And you end up spending a lot of time on your phone. So is it necessarily bad if we are virtualizing ever more? Then, secondly, is excessive even measurable objective? Is it even measurable in objective sense? By that I mean that typically how this research is conducted, people are asked a series of questions. For instance, do you feel irritable if somebody would take your phone away? Do you feel sad if you can't use your phone, etc.? So essentially, this research is based on self-report data. And also from my own research, if we actually tracked people's smartphone use over time, then you could see that actually, for instance, phone checking behavior does not correlate with almost anything. So the fact that you check your phone and you do that, and I suppose many of you in this room may be worried about that, then I would say don't worry. You're not addicted to your phone. Maybe you're highly functional. You actually have something to look into, like waiting something to get from your phone. But what tends to be related to different adverse conditions and outcomes is screen time. So when you spend a lot of time on your device, maybe watching stuff, maybe just browsing mindlessly, then it tends to predict some other things that maybe are not right in your life. Third, maybe it's not the device use per se, but rather it could be some application that drives this excessive use. It's the same issue I brought up earlier. Are people like addicted to their phones or phone use or some specific applications? And lastly, some causal questions: the chicken or chick and the egg. Which came first? Was it some, say depression was first and then you started using a lot of your, devices, or was it the other way around? It's still not that clear. So as you can see, there are several problems with the digital technology research in psychology. That's why we have some opportunities. And as I mentioned, a lot of psychological research is based on self-report data, so people evaluate, stuff about them. For instance, like on average, I spend 5 hours on my smartphone, and then when you actually correlate it with the tracked smartphone usage data, it doesn't correlate at all. So people are really poor in self-estimating stuff like that. But contemporary smartphones also allow us to validate a lot of things in everyday life. They allow us to collect a lot of interesting data, which may be more valid and indicative of people's actual psychological state. This is where an emerging field of psychoinformatics comes in, which basically means you take all the data you have about the person, self-reports, device usage data, device sensor data, self-reports, as I mentioned, and data from other repositories. So a slight example for all these data sources could be, with device use, I mean mainly metadata. So it's how much time do you spend on your smartphone, how often do you look at your smartphone, what are the applications you use, how frequently, what's the duration, etc. Device sensor data is interesting because it allows us to check, for instance, some of the research findings in psychology that are mainly derived, again, from self-reports. For instance, it has been shown that depressed individuals prefer dim rooms, darker environments. Smartphones have the sensors. You can just ask the study participant to keep their smartphone on, say, a counter or in the room where they are, and you could actually check if this ambient light sensor catches the differences or not. Then GPS data, location. There are some interesting studies that already have been conducted, say, with bipolar patients. Bipolar patients tend to have roughly 2 states, depressive states and manic states. In depressive states, they are typically socially isolated, with very little activation, whereas on the manic state, they may experience that they want to get everything done, they travel a lot, and so forth. So a French research team conducted a cool experiment where they looked into GPS data, and they saw that indeed, in depressive states, people are basically home, but when it goes into manic state or mode, then you can see that phone is traveling like this everywhere. So it's kind of interesting. Also sound. There are several even applications that quite well can already recognize the sentiment of people, can say if the person feels like well or not. So all these things can be combined in conjunction with the self-report data and maybe data from other repositories, medical records, education databases, and other stuff you can actually extract from e-governance. Of course, whether it's viable, whether it's ethical, legal even, that's not a question in this fantasy slide I have. So this is almost over now. So finally, if we do have the data, what can we do with this? Firstly, we extract the information about the person. We combine different data sets. If we have decent algorithms that can actually classify and predict accurately what's going on with the person. And typically, one of the giveaways, for that you don't even have to apply neural networks. You can see change in behavior. As soon as you see that the person who has always been active, say on Facebook, always posting stuff, always being cheery, suddenly drops dead, silent, could be something. Maybe not, but it could be something. But think of it as a small, real-world thought experiment. From here, you could think about different, more complex ways to try to understand what's going on with human behavior. And finally, also a bit of intervention. You could use nudges. If you see that person, checks out for maybe being depressed, you typically, don't jump at the person and say, hey, I saw that you're depressed. Let's try to cure you. This is how you scare away the person. The person may lock down and ends up in deeper social isolation. But what you can do is you can prompt some nice things, such as, it's a nice day today. Maybe you could go outside. This is called nudging. So basically, you're trying to give this little push, not this really violent one, but a little push for the person to start living a bit more healthily. And last but not least, why am I talking? It's an e-governance conference, but well, I would say that first of all, it was informative for you, and maybe it busted some myths about smartphone addiction. Again, contemporary, modern researchers don't use this terminology. So, I mean, in Estonian media, you could even see nutinarkomania, which is like smart device narcomania. Then you will ask, what's illegal in that? What's the substance, Also, this was a brief example, or a slight example on how understanding human psychology and behavior could be improved. It was an introduction of some ideas on how smartphones could serve as a good tool or good tools for human behavior and psychology research. And the value of information in this context could also be that some data from e-services maybe could be included. I mean, I have an example where we had, how many of you have heard of PISA research, PISA survey in school children, right? So it's basically every 3 years, I think. They administered these cognitive ability tests plus some surveys about general aspects of life. And what we are able to do today is we can use this survey data from 2015. We can link these data with, say, national exams from 2018. We have 3-year period or a 3-year lag. And basically, if we have some research questions that may also be practical, such as, is ICT so bad that you don't continue your education in university? I mean, tentatively, at least on a conceptual level, you can use these data that are merged together to answer these questions. And that's about it. I mean, it was supposed to be like previous presentations, a slight snack or appetizer of food of thought before you can actually get the real food. So now, if you're not hungry, then kind of sucks for them. So thank you very much.